Alexander Kazyonnov, Theory and History of Marxism, The Red University, 14th of May 2025, Part 2. So the workers go and are forced to sell their labor power and ask the guy who hired them with hat in hand, please hire me, how much will you pay me a month? 20,000 rubles, oh thank you so much. This is called a slave consciousness. Here, us at school, in our Soviet school, we learned to write. In the first grade, we wrote, we are not slaves, back and forth. And now, they're slaves. Who is a slave? Marx has a simple definition. A slave is who is busy 24 hours a day. A slave is the one who's busy 16 hours a day. And so the working class has won from the capitalists quite firmly an 8-hour working day. That is, they reduced the working day twice. They made them free for 8 hours. This is thanks to Russian proletariat, thanks to the Great October Socialist Revolution. They established this 8-hour working day. And the whole world was forced, therefore, to establish the same working day so that the workers would not run away from them to Soviet Russia. In all those capitalist countries, they were forced to use the 8-hour working day. The Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks set the task of transitioning to an 8-hour, to a 6-hour workday, even less. And this task should have been accomplished, but the scoundrel Khrushchev, I don't know to what ambitions of his they were the reason, only shortened the 8-hour day by 1 hour, made the workday 7-hour workday. They didn't give another hour, although there were all prerequisites were there to establish a 6-hour workday already in the 80s or 70s, 1980s. But there are people, even now, who are still fighting for a 6-hour workday. On the other hand, the economy has been brought to a point where people, on one hand, are now working 12 hours a day, although there's no such law. And on the other hand, the famous flagship of Russian agriculture engineering, the Rostov plant of agricultural implements, has moved to a 4-day work week because there's no work. So they work for 4 days. That's what they have managed to do, our management. And now economists scream that loans at 20% are unaffordable. This means that with such loans, production cannot develop in Russia, and it doesn't. The banks give, the central bank. And so there's much to think about. So, this class approach, everyone has already learned it, especially after Marx and Engels wrote about this. And the bourgeois uses this class approach. Only they use it to fight against the workers. They understand perfectly well that the society is divided into classes, that slaves must be forced to work and are encouraged And they always look for ways to reduce wages, to make sure that wages do not grow. Geniuses of the 20th century's economics, headed by Keynes. The main task is to deceive. So they came up with inflation to avoid the wages from growing, to prevent wages from growing. Inflation reduces the cost of labor. Why? Because the price of all products increases, but the price of labor force does not increase. That's all. That's the result. That's why Marx says all the written history is the history of class struggle. The struggle itself will lead to the dictatorship of the proletariat. And the dictatorship of the proletariat is only a transitional society to a society without classes. And with this simple thought, a very simple thought, it's easy to understand, or is something unclear here? What's unclear? Well, can I still ask, well, I haven't read the original, but maybe will there be some other form, some kind of super capitalism? There's nothing to prove here. Some fool came up with something that gives more questions than all the wise men can answer. Super capitalism. What exactly? What kind of? What's this super capitalism? Then we'll talk. What is that exactly? The history of Marxism is instructive in itself, and it's part of the theory. Because in the history of Marxism, we see how Marxism reacted to historical processes, to historical events, and how other forces reacted, and what has come out of it now. I think I told you one example with the spirit. Stalin in 1977, preparing for a speech on the decade of the revolution, said, "The spirit of Marxism has left social democracy." And it really did. And now we can see that it has definitely left social democracy. Why? The fact that in the Federal Republic of Germany, after the war, the Social Democrats ruled for the most part. And now, today, except they have replaced their Chancellor, Scholz. He's a Social Democrat. The president of the Walter Steinmeier, he's also a Social Democrat from the same party. All that remains of social democracy is just the name, and the history of Marxism shows that there have always been, a lot of Marxists. They always wanted to turn this light of holiness onto themselves, to be dedicated to it, that we too are these kind of smart Marxists, and then it turned out that they are not Marxists. And Lenin told them immediately that you are traitors, the entire Second International. They were all considered them Marxists, and they were all turned out to be traitors. Our comrade Khrushchev, based on his own history, also turned out to be a traitor. Not only he's a petty scoundrel and a traitor, he's a criminal. A serious criminal. And since his comrades did not prevent him from committing a crime and covered it up, his crime in relation to Comrade Beria, then his comrades are accomplices in this crime. And since they are accomplices, what does their fate mean? They're running from fate. Yes, they are running from fate, of course. And since they're running from fate, They become entangled in its contradictions, in the web of fate. And they all ended badly, with the exception, perhaps, of Malenkov. The rest all ended badly. Well, in some ways, Molotov and Kazyonnov are better. By the way, Kazyonnov, Moisei Samoilovich, he wrote his memoirs when he was old. And these are the brightest, smartest, most sincere and profound memoirs of Kazyonnov. Until the end of his life, he said that we're workers, we're communists, although he was already 90 years old. He wrote that he stands firmly on the Marxist positions and denies all this nonsense. Well done. And that is why, so to say, the Lord kept him alive until 96 years old, because he lived apparently in harmony with his conscience. And I'm sure he participated in the coolest events there, but they were necessary. And how else? Are there any other ways to deal with the enemies? You have to be rough. He had to participate in all those rough things that were done to the enemies of the state. Let's see at modern guys like Chubais. He stolen tens, hundreds of billions and spent them on empty stuff and then fled. Turned out he sold everything here. I saw the news. Sold all his real estate. Transferred all the funds abroad, and now he thinks he's so successful and smart, and he's probably plotting against Russia something again. By the way, Berezovsky, the other oligarch, was also on the run, and fate pursued him and he got killed. And Gusinsky, the other oligarch, but he still calmed down and still exists, lives somewhere on his dacha in Spain. What about Suslov, Brezhnev's accomplice? Well, he ended up living not too bad. As far as I heard, he was the author of this revisionist, one of the authors of this revisionist ideology, of this well-developed socialism and so on. It seems that he played a very significant role in the collapse of the USSR. Yes, he did play a significant role in the collapse, but in the sense of these subjective evil misdeeds. Such misdeeds, we didn't see him doing any these very evil misdeeds. On the contrary, he's this man in the same suit, always in the same coat. This kind of man who lives in a shell, very careful person, Suslov was. So, in this sense, he lived a calm and a long life, although they say that he did not die a natural death, though. Some very serious historians say that. Well, in the history of Marxism, we can distinguish several stages. The first is the Marxism of the founders, Marx and Engels. It's clear that all their work it's their work that is the basis, and Lenin says that Engels and Marx worked until their death at the age of 75. Marx died and Engels still worked. All his works before 1895 this whole period of about 50 years, it was this initial spread of Marxism. And this was the period when they tried to hush up Marxism. And Lenin draws our attention to this fact that Marxism was hushed up at this first stage. But then this broad public practice of spreading Marxism opens, the first international, then the second international come after Marx's death. Marxism receives great public recognition, therefore it causes criticism and struggle. I wanted to ask you a question about history. So it turns out that when the workers asked Marx to write a manifesto of the Communist Party, was he already known then well or not? Yes, of course. They wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and Marx and Engels participated in social movements and groups also. There were many different groups, starting with 1845. Public activity, yes, and as the writers they published a magazine, published their philosophical works. They were the young Hegelian guys, yes, they were young Hegelians. So, okay, the second stage is Lenin also writes about this. Lenin comes to the stage on the second stage of Marxism. In 1895, Engels dies, and Lenin was already speaking out on the public stage. He even tried to meet Engels, went there, but it didn't work out. And this period, Marxism-leninism, it lasted 30 years until Lenin's death. He was considered to be Engels' successor for some time. Yeah, widely considered in narrow circles. Okay, we need to go to break. Now they speak about Kautsky. Kautsky, of course, corresponded with Engels. They wrote letters to each other, and he collaborated with Engels, yes. And Lenin refers to the Engels of Engels and Kautsky in many letters. Kautsky was honored for his work until August 1st, 1914, and then he became a revisionist. Break. So, as I understand, Alexander Sergeyevich, you recommend reading the Phenomenology of the Spirit, Hegel's Phenomenology of the Spirit. Yes, I do. Read it, of course, although I think that you'll understand even less than in the Science of Logic. It's such a rather difficult work. Because it requires to be competent in many philosophical things. You need philosophical preparation. Anyway, you can still read it and find something there. It's also desirable to have philosophical preparation to study logic, right? Yes, but here categories of the concepts are close to each other, transitioning from each other to each other, explaining each other, and the previous ones shed light on the future. And in Phenomenology of the Spirit, there are different. The Spirit acts in different spheres, and you need to be a little aware of what these spheres are. So this work is more difficult than the Science of Logic, actually. In addition, there's this fact that it's a work where Hegel himself is only becoming Hegel, so to say. So this is such an unfinished Hegelism. some kind of introduction to it. So read some of the topics there. You'll understand them and they'll be useful to you. Something you won't, well, you'll just skip it. These things require a mentor, someone to consult. Or special training. I, for example, graduated from the Faculty of Philosophy here in the Department of History of Philosophy. So for me, this was my main job, and I wrote my diploma on German classical philosophy too. But just a person, a random person who starts reading the phenomenology of spirit, this person will learn, some will understand, they're interesting, they're useful, but. And so Marx and Engels studied, we studied them at the university, their works. And then we took a break and returned to it again when we were adults. And Marx writes that on the eve of the publication of his manuscripts on the criticism of political economy, Capital, before he wrote the Capital, he came across the works of Hegel in the Attic. And the science of logic allowed him to comprehend the structure of this work. This reminded him on logical transitions, logical connections, logical categories. And he was going to write, he said he wanted to write on 4 newspaper sheets, which is 25 pages, so 100 pages. He wanted to rewrite the Hegel's Science of Logic without any mystifications. Marx wanted to do that, but for some reason he didn't. Marx didn't, and I think that's not only because there was little time, but because Hegel did it quite well, especially the first volume. He didn't have time to edit the second and third. It's a difficult task to write some kind of shorter and at the same time more capacious and materialistic version of Hegel's Dialectics. And I think that now this task, we need it, but with a completely new logic. Same categories, same transitions, but cleared of all the tinsel and mystifications. But there is no special need for it. And Science of Logic, especially the first volume, it's quite clear. The second volume is more complicated, and the third, of course, is the most complicated, especially this transition from objective, so-called objective logic to the so-called subjective logic. It's, of course, controversial. Let's continue our lesson. So when Vladimir Ilyich died on when he became 24,
Marxism-leninism,
in 1924.
Marxism-leninism, Leninism, Marxismом 20 века.
Leninism, they started calling Leninism Marxism of the 20th century, and this is a very correct thing to do, because the 20th century entered capitalist imperialism, this imperialism came into full force. This is not emphasized, and that's why people are confused. They somehow cannot reconcile in their minds that, you know, the Emperor Peter I, he's an emperor, but there was no imperialism. Was it? So why did it start in the 20th century? Because earlier imperialism was slave owners imperialism of Alexander the Great, the Roman Empire, Roman slavery imperialism, feudal era. There was a Holy Roman Empire. There was feudal imperialism. Genghis Khan, which also had his empire included Russia as a Julus, as a region. It was his empire of Genghis Khan. So now imperialism is capitalist. And Lenin's work, imperialism as the high stage of capitalism, it is used all over the world. And the bourgeoisie does too. They understand that Lenin described the situation correctly. Another thing is that Lenin is criticized for the fact that he didn't take into account the degree of monopolization. Did not explain the role of the American Federal Reserve System. Well, it's a guy named Valentin Yurievich Kazyonnov. My dear, this system was formed in America in the December of 1913. Who knew about it? Even America, they didn't know what the bankers came up with. This reserve system. How could Lenin in 1915 knew everything and knew the consequences? Come on, this is... You're not serious. Some of our literate, cultured comrades say that Federal Reserve System was created in 1913, and because of that, the First War began, and the Second World War also was organized by them. Dear comrades, that's not serious, some kind of kindergarten. Although they are themselves personally quite serious people. Or Bug Life, the director of the foundry and metal plant in Cherepovets city, a serious guy, a literary guy. He understands modern economics very well, thoroughly, and at the same time he's got these fantasies that signs and symbols rule the world. Well, think a little. But the people rule, using, of course, them as help, the signs and symbols. And also they use in the army, the police, and the media, and deception, and with the help of everything that is in their hands. But he wants to show off that he knows some kind of Masonic secrets. There's a Mason base somewhere under the floor doing something, and he knows everything. But we are not interested in what they're doing. Nothing is really hidden. Nothing is secret. They write that Russia will be destroyed, that the new world order will be built on the fragments of Russia, remnants of Russia, and at the expense of Russia. This is all pretty open, that Russia will be divided. They do not hide that. Lord Polston, since 1842, wrote that. Well, you know, we don't care if they want to do this to Russia, doesn't matter what they want. They want that for how many years? Second or third century. For several hundred years, right? For a couple of hundred years. But we don't care what they want. What did they do? For example, the Masons were active in 1917. So what? Nekrasov was their leader. Who knows Nekrasov? You don't know him, and you are literal to people. But I know, well, one of those idiots who were running around there wanted to create a council of Russia, but they didn't. Why? Because they were all quarreling, all the bourgeoisie, in addition to their common interest. The main thing is private personal interest, and they cannot seriously agree on big things. Oh well. God be with them. So, Marxism-leninism. So, Marxism-leninism after 1924, or rather 1917, but especially 1924, turned into practical activity, the practice of building socialism, especially after 1924. And this, of course, radically changed the entire world. But at that time, Joseph Stalin also entered the arena, and of course, as a practitioner, and at the same time, and inevitably a theorist, he also took a prominent place in Marxist science, in Marxist ideology, in Marxism as an ideological and political movement, and so on and so forth. And this period, of course, also lasted 30 years until his death. And it must be, we should say that after his death, everything changed significantly. But nevertheless, Leninism influenced in such a way that theory and practice finally merged in socialism. As if theory and practice were, I mean Marxist theory, they were going in some kind of parallel. And theory periodically influenced practice from time to time, but it had not yet merged with it. But here they merged. Practice was carried out precisely on the basis of Marxist theory. And this is the uniqueness of this period from 24 to 53, 30 years. About 30 years. But when Stalin died, the situation changed significantly. And for the next 30 years until Perestroika, theory began to live its own life separately from practice. Practical politics started being separate, and economic practice was the third separate thing. And there was discord and division, the party split, society was splitting. We did not understand that at the time. But it really began to split more and more in the 60s, in the 70s and 80s. And at the end of the 80s, it had already split thoroughly, completely, and almost. And in the 86th year, works appear in 86, in the 1990, works that designate a new stage of Marxism. The previous one can be called the stage of Leninism after Stalin's death. So that was the Leninism that sublated Marxism, and Marxism sublated Hegel, the science of logic, dialectical method. But since 86, this modern kind of Leninism has arisen. Modern Leninism as denying anti-Stalinist ideology and politics within the CPSU, the revision, and within the Soviet state.
Такими работами, прежде всего, сталинскую идеологию, политику внутри КПСС и внутри советского государства.
As such works, first of all, who deny anti-Stalinism, are works by Mikhail Vasilyevich Popov, The contradictions of socialism is the first phase of communism. He wrote that in 1986, an outstanding work. This work showed that anti-communism is not had shown that anti-communism is not an accidental thing, but is an inevitable moment of the first phase of communism. And this was written about and outlined a little by Marx, that between socialism and capitalism there's a transitional period of the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. And only after this period does socialism come. And socialism still bears the imprints of capitalism in it. They explained to us at school that imprints remained only in the consciousness and behavior of people. So your average Tom and Bobby are, people without real conscience. They still have imprints, but those bosses higher up, of course, they didn't have any imprints. It didn't occur to us that they could have.
Только из вот этого понимания, вот этой теории, что это не одни отпечатки на все
imprints are unavoidable. They're on the whole aspects of life, economic, moral, political, ideological. These imprints are everywhere. On Khrushchev, on Brezhnev, on whomever you want, on everyone. They're there, imprints of capitalism. They need to be eradicated. They need to be fought, the imprints of capitalism. And in 1961, the comrades of the Central Committee of the CPSU decided that it was not necessary. We have already built, they thought, a state of the whole people, and party has become a people's party. There are no shortcomings at all, and we will somehow cope with individual shortcomings that are left. That's they thought. They thought wrong. Some other works on this topic were written. Yelmeev, Vasily Yelmeev, Viktor Georgievich Dolgov, Yelmeev and Dolgov, they developed this labor theory of consumer value. And this is really a very important thing. This thing was not realized in Soviet times. Didn't really think of it. They didn't really think of it. The economic science didn't describe it thoroughly. What this new technology should be, and why you need the new technology, and what is its effect, why it exists, and how it should be achieved and implemented and put into practice. And so Dolgov is the student of Yelmeev, and under the guidance of Yelmeev, he completed this doctoral dissertation and wrote this book about this technical progress. And in the same line there are works and speeches of Alexei Sergeyev about the Soviets. The very concept of Soviets by our time, when I was already an associate professor and a candidate of sciences, I had already learned that Soviets' councils are the organs of power formed on the basis of enterprises, on the basis of production cells, production shops in plants and factories. Well, we thought Soviets are, just of workers and laborers. And for us, councils of workers and their deputies, workers' deputies, this was the same. But in fact, this is a fundamental thing, the most fundamental. Why? Because we're talking about sovereignty of the state and the people. Sovereign Council convened after the revolution And this was recorded in the first constitution. The supreme power, it was stated, the supreme power belongs to the Congress of Consuls, Soviets, of the workers and peasants, soldiers, deputies. So the representatives of the workers, peasants and others came to the Congress, Soviet, and this is the supreme power. It makes fundamental decisions and appoints the highest authorities, the government, the legislature, and the executive power, the judicial power. There was no distinction between supreme power and the highest power. And the bourgeois ideologists of the hammered into our heads the separation of powers, that it is necessary to separate powers so that they don't concentrate in one thing. Therefore, three separate powers, branches are needed. Branches of power. Branches, but there is no stem. In this moment, there's no trunk. There's no trunk. No root, but there are roots. There are, right? The people are roots. Its trunk is society, and the trunk is the power itself in the proper sense of the word. The power itself in the proper sense of the word is the supreme power. The rest of them are not powers in the proper sense of the word, but they are organs of power. And in 1936, the Supreme Council, it was an organ of power. It's an organ, Supreme Soviet. Organs of power now are everywhere. Where is the supreme power? What is the supreme power? Do you know? That's a big question. Say, for example, Trump. Is he the supreme power? No. Of course not. And now they came up with this deep state idea that somewhere deep down inside a deep state exists. So what kind of deep state is this? That some comrades. There are certain guys who installed Trump, right? And Trump pretends to be such an independent fellow. This one was, the previous one was a fool, he didn't understand anything, he started a war, some kind of bad war. But who allowed him to start a war, even though you are a president? Are you a supreme power? No. Warriors. Wars. It is written in the Constitution. Who starts wars? It's not as if Biden just came and started the war. Or Trump came now and now he will, stop the war. This is a cynical deception. Cynical deception. From top to bottom. Whom were we defending ourselves from? The red line. Drew the red line. From NATO. From NATO. Who's the chief guy in NATO? America. And America is now pretending that it was Zelensky who started the war. And our president allowed this, and this war shouldn't have started. Making fools out of people in exactly the same way as the churchmen. Like the church says, they killed Christ and he just went and, resurrected, rose again. But if he rose again, if people can be resurrected like this, and people believe that kind of thing, then they can be told any kinds of lies if they believe such things. And now it seems like everyone agrees with this, right? Seem to agree with this. Zelensky, he started doing something wrong, and he's to blame for the war, suddenly. And our people agree, yes, that was Zelensky, we need to talk to them, to the Zelensky in Turkey, and, sort stuff out. That is not how these things are sorted, resolved. These are issues of a different level. And we need concepts, we need spirit, we need will. Spirit is the unity of mind and will. Reason, or reason and will. Reason suggests what is truth, and the will realizes this truth, puts it into practice. A strong will persist, and weak will not. I decided to quit smoking. So I didn't smoke for a week, drank some beer, and suddenly wanted to smoke. And okay, just once. And the next day, once again, and so it went again. Like Mark Twain said, I stopped smoking 17 times. So his will is weak. He finally stopped smoking. That's the question of will. Will is the final decision, a decision that is carried out in life, an idea that is put into practice. And of course, a strong will is needed for that. A strong spirit, right? What does this mean? Strong spirit, strong will. And where is it, the will strong? When it is guided by a smart, intelligent idea, by a just idea, moral idea, then this is strong. When there is true God leads to victory. As in Christianity. Christianity allowed Rome to conquer the entire region, the entire Kumene. Or Arabs under the banner of Muhammad. It allowed them to conquer northern Africa as far as Spain, all that space, and to end with the Byzantine Empire, by the way. Why? Because the Muslim spirit at the time was developing strongly, and Byzantium, the Byzantine spirit, sank into debauchery, into injustice. That was the end of it. So everything is connected, everything is arranged quite reasonably, but needs arranged in a struggle through struggle, which we have studied here, and in the sense of economics and politics and ideological struggle and science. And the history of Marxism completely confirms this theory. Completely. So that is why now this modern Leninism, it arose, appeared when an era ended, and it became clear who was who and what was what. Before this, it was not entirely clear. They told us, yes, there's lots of bad stuff, funny Khrushchev. I came from school every day with a new joke about Khrushchev. And Brezhnev is somehow not very good and ambiguous. On the one hand, they seem to have this criticism of Brezhnev stopped this criticism of Stalin, but on the other hand, Stalin was still ignored in textbooks, and no books of his about him were published. All these ambiguities existed, but we didn't realize it at the time. Why? Because this tendency, it has not fully manifested itself. It only became fully apparent at the end of the 80s. And I think we should say in our defense that we spoke out against this tendency back in 1987. In 1988, public organizations were already created that fought against Gorbachev's regime, and we were already seriously fighting Yeltsin, organizing rallies on the Dvortsovaya Square, and these rallies gathered, some of them 50,000 people, about 50,000 people. But this is only a narrow circle of people who understood these things. then. The majority of people were already so bourgeois, mired in everyday life, and it seems like the words were correct, but we spoke. But the spirit of Marxism left them. But we have preserved it, the spirit of Marxism, and we are reviving it and even partly developing it to the best of our abilities. And I think we'll do some other positive things in this regard. So on this optimistic note, we can finish this lecture which has lasted for this long time. It's a final lecture in our number of lectures here in Red University. That we're supposed to create this holistic image in your mind. Probably some questions are left. I will be happy to answer them. Yes, the question is, after all, the definition of capital, is it self-increasing value? Is it a definition, scientific definition? Yes, it is. I heard that they go deeper into the essence of things in Marx's Capital. They expand this definition. There's a whole theory of value in the first paragraphs of the work. And the deployment of the definition, detailed definition, is given there. There are no other special definitions. The cost is one of the steps, one of the moments of the development of the capital category. The first ones are the emptiest. Like the category of being in the science of logic. This means that coming to be and ceasing to be. So that's the exchange value and the consumer value. They pass, just like coming to be and ceasing to be, they transition into each other, and you don't need anything else. Another thing is that later, in all other categories, these categories are sublated. This means that all sorts of money is also a commodity, labor is also a commodity, workforce, fixed capital is also a commodity. They are sublated and in this sense filled with content. As Hegel says in his Science of Logic, the definition of one's further movement should be erfüllen, filled with content. Why? Because due to the fact that it meets certain conditions or opposite, something opposite, and it's enriched. Therefore, so the most specific thing is written at the end of the work. It is important to see this value within all other categories, all other movements. Let's say the cost of labor. We distinguish between the cost of labor and the cost of means of production or materials. We do distinguish between what the cost of labor means and what the cost is. The value of labor and value, they are different, right? Labor force also has a price. Has a value, price, and the price on the market. That is, so the salary, wages is the price of labor force. Or cost. But it is not accurate. The price of labor. And the price may correspond to the actual cost of the work, labor, power, or may not. as a rule, it is less than the real value, actual value of work, labor, power, workforce. So on the one hand, we have the definition of the concept, and the concept, how it develops and what it encounters in relation to what it does it relate to, what does it define. Then passive capital, they got some other definitions there. Yes, different ones, many different definitions of capitals, different capitals. So, are we done with the questions? Yes. End of part 2, guys, and I do my best to translate all this. This is some very serious stuff. I hope, well, you understand at least the gist of what is being said here, so that I have helped you with that. I know my translation is not perfect, but you know, it's better than nothing. And this is some really cool stuff. This is real knowledge of guys who taught Marxism-leninism. This guy taught philosophy of it his whole life, and so they are those who preserved modern Leninism and still are developing it, just like those their teachers mentioned, Dolgov, Yelmeyev, and others. So these are real modern, hardcore, scientific, systemic Marxists-Leninists, Kazyonnov, Popov, and other people from the Workers' Academy Fund, and I will keep translating all this so that you could maybe understand some of this, at least the main points they're making, right? And to systematize your knowledge of Marxism-Leninism, because this is a big problem nowadays. We do not have the systematic knowledge of it, and of Marxism-Leninism, and the Red University is making an effort to, a successful one, to actually systematize, make all this scientific, right? Okay, so bye-bye, see you next time.